Hello, my name is Estrella Vargas, and you are watching Political Forum. It is a special show where we invite mayoral candidates to speak about their platforms. So today we have Mr. Paul Vallas, sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you so much for coming in today.
It's a pleasure.
I know you're busy catching calls and everything, but we appreciate you coming in and speaking to the people of Chicago about your platform.
Yes. Well, actually, I'm busy catching colds today.
Oh, yeah, it's that season.
Campaign cold, and it always happens late in the campaign.
Oh, no. Hopefully you get over it soon. So today we're going to talk about overall the importance of the millennial vote, and overall just your political platform and why you should be mayor of Chicago.
Well, first of all, I'm a lifelong public servant. There are actually 6 veterans in my household. There are 4 police officers. There's 1 firefighter. My niece is an airline pilot, age 30. She flew in a all-women's crew the other day, both the pilot, the co-pilot, and obviously all the attendants. She sent me a picture, which I said, "You mean it's taken this long?" And then, of course, my wife was a police officer. My sons are policemen, and of course, they're veterans. My oldest son was actually in combat in Afghanistan. He was a combat vet. But I think the point that I'm trying to make, though, is the Vallas family has been, we're the grandson of Greek American immigrants, south side of Chicago, and we're a family of public servants. We have always been public servants, and we have always answered the call and responded to calls. And having spent 12 years working for the state legislature under the late Dawn Clark Netsch and Senate President Phil Rock, my public service career started very, very early. And in 1990, Mayor Daley asked me to come to Chicago to clean up the scandal-ridden revenue department, to take over the city's budget in the mid-90s when the city was in deep financial crisis, and then to run the Chicago Public Schools when the schools financially collapsed. So all my public service jobs have been kind of a call to action. In fact, when I left Chicago in 2001, after 6 years as chief of the schools, I went to Philadelphia. The state had taken over that financially bankrupt school system, and I basically repaired and restored that district. And then after Katrina all but destroyed New Orleans, I was asked to go to New Orleans to rebuild the school system in New Orleans. And after the devastating earthquakes in Haiti and then later Chile, I did international relief work. And in fact, the last public service assignment I had was working for Sally Yates, at the time the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, on revamping education in the federal prison system. So the point that I'm trying to make is I have been tasked with going in and doing massive turnarounds, turning around government institutions that had multi-billion-dollar budgets, that were in financial disarray, and that had failed to provide the basic services that their constituents needed. So I think the city needs a mayor who understands budget and finance, who understands the importance of long-term financial planning, and most important, understands that you need to design budgets and you need to develop long-term financial plans that will invest in the communities, because this city needs to grow. This city has lost 70% of its residential property value since the Great Recession in 2008. We are the fastest shrinking big city in the country in terms of loss of population. And what's happening is the tax base, the city's wealth, is contracting. Well, we have areas of the city that are showing robust growth. 80% of the city has experienced no new investment, and certain areas of the city, particularly on the west sides and the south sides, have been in a state of deep economic depression for decades, for 30, 40 years. The Rosen-Pullman area where I grew up has been in a deep depression since I was in my 20s. And trust me, I'm not even close to being in my 20s now. So we're talking about almost over 3 decades. So clearly there are great challenges before us, and the city needs someone who knows how to run the city, but knows how to run the city so that it benefits all communities, so that you're leaving no neighborhood behind. And I think those are the skills that I bring to the mayor's race, and that's the case that I'm trying to make to the voters.
And it seems like you have a holistic skills and experience, and that's amazing. And like before we get into more of like answering questions, I just want to
Absolutely.
remind the viewers that this is a live show. So if you want to call in and ask any questions to Mr. Vallas, then the number's under your screen.
Very good.
And we're here to answer any of your questions.
Okay.
Well, you're here to answer their questions, not me.
Okay.
So you answered a lot about how you want to move the city forward and specific like ideas that you have for the city. But how will you address connecting more resources that support like new moms, new dads, new families in general, like providing groups and workshops or other resources that like instruct and guide them on how to start families and to maintain a healthy family?
Well, let me just say a couple things. And one of the things I did, and I was probably the first, Lori Lightfoot and I were probably the first named candidates to enter the race before Emmanuel dropped out. So we challenged him early on. We did not want him to go unchallenged. And so as early as April, I began to lay out a series of specific proposals to deal with solutions like social service infrastructure in the community, how to develop the poorest communities in the city, how to end gentrification in areas where there's economic growth, how to deal with what to do with the 50-plus closed schools. And my website, vallasforallchicago.com, lays those plans out in great detail. And I welcome people to look at the website. But let me answer this question about services. We need to do two things to expand the services and in a way so that they can reach everyone in the community. First of all, when I ran the schools from 1995 to 2001, it was a period of dramatic growth in the schools in terms of the number of students. 30,000 more students than when we came in, 70,000 more students than they have today. And we never closed a single school because the schools were growing. But we turned all of our schools into community centers. So they were centers, early childhood education. In fact, we had a prenatal program for pregnant teens. So we were reaching the children before they were born. But our schools, we provided children with 3 meals a day. We provided them with eyeglasses. We provided them with medical attention and medical care. We put clinics in our schools. Our schools were open till 8 o'clock every night for after school and early evening academic and enrichment and recreational opportunities. We had our schools open 6 weeks over the summer, offering the same type of services. So the schools became a vehicle for helping the community access to services that they need. They were not only learning institutions, but they were almost like community social service centers. And I'm going to return to that model of the community as schools as the center of the community, someplace where parents can go to be able to be connected to all the services, whether they're legal aid services, whether they're connecting parents to English language classes, particularly for immigrant parents who want to improve their English, etc. Because we had adult education programs in many of our programs, particularly for children, the parents of children who wanted to improve their English. So the whole idea was to have those schools as community centers. So that's the first thing I would do. The second thing that I'm going to do.
Before you go into the
Yes.
second part, we do have a call.
Okay.
And we don't want to keep the caller waiting.
Absolutely.
So can we listen to your call?
Yes, good afternoon. I have a question concerning building trust back in office and actually in Chicago politics, generally speaking.
Yes.
Chicago is known by a lot of people as being corrupt. We have aldermen who have been corrupt, have been charged. A lot of people don't believe that the Chicago government is really there for the people, though we elect people to office. How do you change that rhetoric? How do you change that stance that a lot of voters have, to make sure that if we elect you, that you're going to help, clean up the Chicago government and Chicago politics?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to obviously have the type of comprehensive ethics ordinance that doesn't create any gray areas, that allows elected officials to basically profit on the side while they're still holding public office, that restricts their ability to earn income once they've selected, once they've been elected to public office. I mean, look, there are so many aldermen who, there are elected officials who have conflicts. On the one hand, they're elected officials. On the other hand, they do property tax appeals work, and they've made millions of dollars over the years, basically taking advantage of a flawed system that they've refused to fix. So at the end of the day, having a very, very tough ordinance that in effect restricts what you can do, family members getting contracts, etc., nepotism, there's no substitute for a very strict ordinance. But even a strict ordinance can be manipulated, as we've seen in so many cases. There's a scandal in Chicago, and there's a scandal in the city. The aldermen get together, they propose a tough ordinance, and then 5 years later, 6 years later, more aldermen are getting indicted. A big part of this has to do with leadership, too. I have said that there's no substitution for term limits. And I'm going to push for term limits, not only for the city, not only for the mayor's office, but also for the city council. There's no more effective campaign finance reform than term limits, than not allowing somebody to be in office for 40 or 50 years. And as you know, I was the only candidate early on to support Pat Quinn's referendum to get on the ballot on term limits that they're still litigating. So ultimately we have to work for term limits. And then the third thing is just the attitude and the approach that you take. So on the one hand, term limits will solve a lot of our problems. On the other hand, a very strict ordinance will make it tougher for people to cross the line, or will make people more vulnerable to investigation, to indictments if they cross the line, if they violate the law, or at least subject to impeachment or to mandatory resignation. But at the end, having the type of leader in office that is not part of the pay-to-play culture is very critical too. I ran for governor in 2001 after I left the Chicago Public Schools. And I left Chicago Public Schools because Mayor Daley and I had a falling out for 3 reasons. One is I was too popular. Two is, and I'm not being narcissistic. I mean, I was perceived as a potential competitor, although I loved running the schools. 2 is I pulled all the contracts out of the Public Building Commission so that I could independently bid those contracts, and I could set very high targets for minority contracting, minority hiring. 54% of all of the contracts I awarded through school construction alone, $3.2 billion in contracts. 54% went to Black and Latino companies, and 58% of the workers hired were Black and Latino. So I took the politics out of the awarding of the contracts. And the third reason was I wouldn't close schools, because I felt the closing of schools destabilized neighborhoods, and I would rather put programs into schools to grow the schools. So it's that type of leader that you need. And incidentally, when I ran against Rod Blagojevich, I got outspent 14-1. I only lost by 1.5 percentage points for governor. And the 4 candidates who just happened to enter this race after Rahm Emanuel dropped out, Gary Chico, Tony Preckwinkle, Bill Daley, and Mendoza, all supported either Rod Blagojevich or somebody else. So I've been this route before. I've always been the candidate best equipped to manage the city, to manage the finances, but I've always been the candidate that the political elites were reluctant to support or did not want to see occupy public office, because I've never been part of that pay-to-play culture. So I hope I've answered the question, and I apologize for being a little lengthy.
No, you're fine. But it looks like we have another call.
Okay.
So caller, do you have a question or comment?
Good morning. Yes, you already talked about term limits, which was my question, if you had a stance on that. But so you believe in term limits.
Yes.
How do you think what approach will you take to get the aldermen to help pass term limits?
Well, I've always believed that if you come in with a mandate to lead, and you chart a course for the city that is the type of populist course that generates broad community support, the aldermen will fall into lockstep. Let me give you an example. The budgets in the 1990s were very contentious. In fact, Mayor Daley early on used to there was a lot of opposition to the budgets that he introduced. I became budget director after his his previous year budget had been rejected. But when I took over the city, the long-term plan I developed for the city about neighborhood improvements, infrastructure repairs, improved public safety, etc., was so popular, we had unanimous support. When I went to the schools, the support we received in the community generated a lot of support within the aldermanic ranks, because when the public embraces something, and this is where having 50 aldermen sometimes can work to your advantage, it is reflected in the positions that the aldermen take in the city council. So I've always felt that if I can chart a course for the city, and if that course also includes the type of political reforms that are critical, like term limits, I think that will have, I think I would be able to motivate enough support to get something on the ballot that could be approved. Look, they got the Quinn initiative on the ballot. What they did was they created obstacles to the approval of that initiative by getting it watered down. But if the mayor's office had taken the lead, or had not opposed, or had not tried to booby trap or set roadblocks for the term limit initiative for mayor alone, that would have passed. It would have been on the ballot. We would have term limits. So a lot of it begins and ends with the mayor's office. I will tell you one thing that you can do that does not necessarily require aldermanic approval, and that is, at the very least, you push for term limits for the mayor, and then you, in effect, push for term limits for the chairmanship of these critical committees. I mean, how long was Burke chairman of the Finance Committee? 3 decades plus? Workman's Comp put in the Finance Committee. Those were all decisions that were made by the mayor's office. The mayor could have easily used his influence and his clout to, in effect, have rotating chairmanships. So no one is ever put in that type of position of a power and authority, for not multiple terms, but multiple decades. And I think those are things that you could do to at least, bring a degree of limits in terms of term limits for the mayor, term limits for the committee chairs. These are things that could easily be done, could easily get approved. A much larger issue of term limits for aldermen obviously would require a much stronger support, but at least you'd be able to accomplish the first two, I think, relatively easily.
And it looks like you are very popular, because we have another caller. Caller, do you have a question or comment?
I do. Hey, Paul. My name is Jay. I appreciate you giving me the time.
My pleasure.
I was looking at the roadmap to fiscal stability that you have on your website, and given what I know about the state's pension crisis, it seems like your plan has an awful lot focused on getting more money from the state, $771 million. And given that Pritzker has not wanted to open up the Constitution, and we have, a couple $100 billion that we got to pay out in pension payments, I don't know how feasible it is to expect more money from the state.
Great, so let me respond. Actually, and I'm glad you looked at the site. What I did was I laid out a strategy for how to address the pension issue, stabilize the city finances, and then, in effect, move the city forward in terms of developing a budget that was a long-term investment document. A part of that is putting together a state agenda. And let me explain the state agenda that I've laid out. Because if you look at the plan, all the things I've listed in terms of what I would do at the state level, what I would do to reduce the expenditure base of the city, and then what would be needed in terms of additional city revenues over the years, it is designed to not only address the pension issue and balance the budgets, but also designed to, fund, contracts which will have to be financed, because there's going to be new contracts with fire and police. In other words, it'll have to account for the natural growth in governmental expenditures that are going to occur because new contracts are negotiated, et cetera. There are going to be governmental expenses that cannot be avoided. But a big part of that is the legislative agenda that I've laid out. And basically what I said in my legislative agenda is this. The prospects for everybody coming together on some sort of a grand compromise to get a constitutional amendment to change the way pensions are funded or to change pension benefits is not going to happen. It's not going to happen because politically it's just not going to happen. There's not going to be enough support for it. And the governor-elect has already said he's not going to support it. So it's almost like dead on arrival. So what I've said is we've got to have an agenda that we will be able to bring to Springfield and that we'll be able to present to the governor when he moves to increase the income tax. The governor said he's going to increase the income tax. I said if he's going to increase the income tax, we need to have a fair share component. And these are the three things that I'm calling for. Number one, don't change the local government distributive fund formula that says that local governments are supposed to get a percentage of the income taxes. They did that the last two times they raised the income tax. That's, and no one was there to tell them not to. But our position should be no change in the local government distributive fund formula, number one. Number two, with Pritzker in as governor, one would hope that the governor would stop diverting about $300 million in local government revenue that they're supposed to get from, it's called the Corporate Personal Property Replacement Tax. It was a tax created and mandated by the Constitution to replace the abolished tax on personal property, used to tax personal property. So if they did those two things alone, it would generate about $250 to $300 million that the city would receive. Not immediately, but they would receive it. It would ramp up over a period of 5 years. And then the third thing I said is, while we made progress the last year in getting the state to bring funding equity to the funding of teacher pensions, because the state has always paid the employee share, the employer share of the downstate teachers' pensions, while the city's been stuck with paying the employer share of the Chicago teachers' pensions. Well, we took steps to change that because now the state provides equal treatment when it comes to liability going forward, but they're still not contributing anything to cover past liability. Well, if we were able to phase in full equity over a period of 5 years, the amount of money we will be getting from the measures that I described over a period of 5 years would be about $500 million. And what that would do is that would, in effect, reduce by half the amount of new money that we would then be compelled to put into the pension system. Now, that may seem like a lot of money, but built up over 5 years, it's not, particularly when you look at the size of the state budget. And all the things that I'm asking for are things that the state's supposed to be doing anyway. And at least two of the three things I'm asking for, not changing the local government distributive fund and ending the diversion of the corporate personal property tax revenues, are things that hurt local governments throughout the state. So I've laid out an agenda that's going to have the support of all the municipalities and counties throughout the state. So it's a very reasonable agenda because remember, the additional $1 billion we have to put in pensions is not immediate. We have to put it in, we have to ramp up by $1 billion by 2023. So my agenda equally ramps up so that by 2023, more than half of the additional money that's needed will be covered by our state agenda. I then believe that just through government efficiencies, getting a handle on overtime. The city in some years has paid as much as $300 million in overtime. Taking workman's comp out of the finance committee so that we can realize some real savings. I've laid out 12 things that we can do just on the government efficiency side to provide over the next 5 years the expenditure reductions needed so that we can have, with that saved money, put that money in the pension system so we can solve the pension issue. I believe that my agenda is very practical and very realistic, and municipalities are all across the street going to be rallied around it, and that my expenditure reductions, look, I can find 5, 6, 7% expenditure savings in my sleep. I have always done that in every single budget. I've always found efficiencies. So I believe with confidence that we'll be able to address our pension funding issue, balance our budget, and then, in effect, cap the growth of future property tax increases so no one will ever have to face draconian property tax increases to fund things like pensions and other things again. In fact, in my proposal, if you look at it, I talk about a permanent cap on property taxes so that taxes would never rise more than the rate of inflation, or 5%, whichever is less. And if you look historically, what that really means is taxes, even if your assessments grow by 20, 30%, your taxes will never grow by more than 1 to 2%. That would end gentrification, and it would protect homeowners in all communities, particularly those communities where their development is driving up the value of your property and driving up your taxes. So I know that's a complicated, it's probably, I don't want to say it's too complicated, but I know that's a long-winded answer, but there's pieces to this puzzle. And remember, when there's a 5-year ramp up. It's a 5-year plan to get us out of this mess, because the additional $1 billion that we're going to need to put in pensions is not next year. It ramps up by $1 billion every year till 2023. At that point, the pensions will be stabilized and will be on a more normal funding increase schedule, where the increases every year will be modest and financially manageable.
And I want to show the viewers your website so they can get more information.
Yes.
Everything you've been talking about today, they can find it on your website. It's vallasforallchicago.com.
That's my father's picture there. Just want to add up. I'm joking.
Twins.
Also,
And
look
then
me up
here's
on Facebook too, because
Facebook? Okay.
I put everything on Facebook. All of my initiatives, I'll even be posting my questionnaires from the various groups that have sent us like dozens of questionnaires asking us various questions on various issues. So I'll be posting those too, and happy reading.
So unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I want to thank you so much for coming in.
It's my pleasure.
And speaking to the people and answering their questions. So again, if you have any further questions or want to contact Mr. Vallas, go to his website. All his information is on there, emails and phone number. This was Political Forum. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.